Hi there, podcast listeners. It's Aidan Grant. I'm very excited to say this is my first cold open to a podcast episode, which I guessed I'd have to do eventually. In the episode you're about to hear, I make reference to the UK tax treatment of foreign charities and how the law has developed over the last few decades to relax the rules slowly governing gifts to non-UK charities. Since Joe and I recorded this episode, the UK has published new legislation that effectively limits all form of UK charitable tax relief only to UK charities. Now, this is a developing discussion as we tax advisors consider what this means for our foreign charity clients, but I felt it was important for you to know that these rules have been changing, and so what was in the original recording with Joe is perhaps not quite as up to date as it now is. Of course, if you have any questions about these changes, then please don't hesitate to get in contact. And in the meantime, we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second part of this two-part episode looking at US-UK cross-border philanthropy. I'm still here with Joe Crome of the Charities Aid Foundation. We're now going to look at some of the more detailed issues that arise in cross-border philanthropy, as well as some of the broader themes and trends that Joe's seen in the last few years. And before the break, Joe had just teed up one of the most common topics for discussion in cross-border philanthropy, which is tax efficiency. This is a tax and estate planning podcast, after all. So, Joe, my understanding of the principal issue in this sector is that, like so much of US-UK tax planning, and if there was any theme to this podcast, it would be precisely this, the US and the UK are not as in lockstep on matters of charitable taxation as people might think that they are, and there is great opportunity, or there are great risks of people falling into cracks between the two different jurisdictions over charitable giving being tax efficient in one country but not tax efficient in the other. How do you start that conversation with clients? Where's the kind of the jumping off point for you?
Yeah, so actually, I can give you a little trip down memory lane actually to help illustrate some of the work that we've done at CAF. So my role at CAF involves leading the American Donor Fund, which is what became the first ever dual qualified charity. And what we mean by that is a charity that is deemed as both a charitable entity in the UK and the US. And that entity resulted from lots of clients back in the 1990s at CAF, primarily Americans living in the UK, who were frustrated that they were in the UK earning and in some cases paying tax twice, where the income tax treaty wasn't exhaustive, and were frustrated that if they wanted to give to a charity, that there was actually only a single set of relief for that gift. So if they were giving to a US charity, then there was no UK tax relief on that gift. CAF at the time explored that, and we worked with a legal firm Withers to try and understand whether you actually could really align both the tax treatment and the charitable equivalency of the regulations between the two countries to create what would be deemed a dual qualified gift. And 22 years later, the American Donor Fund has seen over $1 billion of donations come through, and it works actually quite simply. And actually, the regulations overlap enough to make that charity effective for clients. So effectively what it is, it's a UK charity that is created, which then becomes immediately a wholly owned subsidiary of a 501c3 public charity in the United States. And the provisions between the two organizations, and quite importantly, the independence of both organizations as well, mean that a gift to that UK charity is also deemed as a tax effective gift in the United States as well.
And it's probably worth sort of hovering there and reiterating the point. So the tax reliefs that you're looking to get in the UK when you make a charitable gift, let's say you're looking to get maybe gift tax on an income gift, or you're looking to get inheritance tax exemption on a gift to a charity, these broadly apply to UK charities. Even if the organization you want to give to in, let's say, the US would satisfy the requirements for a UK charity, where in the UK, you, in most cases, won't get the charitable relief because it's not a UK charity. There are various court cases that have gone through the UK courts the last few years trying to expand that. One which was trying to make the point that gifts to EU charities while we were in the EU, for example, would contravene the freedom of movement of capital argument. But it is still the case that, strictly speaking, gifts to non-UK charities don't attract tax relief. In the US, it's obviously more nuanced because as a citizen, you're subject to taxation worldwide, and so that Americans don't have the same sort of sense of territoriality. But Americans have differing levels of tax relief depending on whether you make a gift during lifetime or on death. And you can end up in a very common scenario, which I discuss with a lot of clients when I do will planning, for example, where an American living in the UK wants to make a gift to a US charity under their will. And what I'm saying to them is, if you make that gift to a US charity, you're not going to get tax relief in the UK because that's a foreign charity. So you can't just make your gift straight to an American charity. Otherwise, that gift will incur 40% inheritance tax. And if you make that gift during your lifetime and that American charity happens to be a company, you might also get an immediate 20% inheritance tax charge on a gratuitous transfer into a company. And this kind of sting in the tail, I think, shocks and surprises quite a lot of clients when they think, I'm trying to do good here. I'm not being allowed to do good because actually the taxman's going to take possibly as much as 40% of my gift before it reaches the recipient country. And so where dual qualified charities come in is saying, well, we'll take your gift, we'll give you the tax relief in both countries, and then if you want to pick up the thread, Joe, presumably then you have that discussion about how to pass it on.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the UK and US operate in a very similar way with regards to lifetime giving to charities. So absolutely, the HMRC requires that you make a gift that runs through a UK charity. That's where you've made a charitable gift to a UK charity registered with the Charity Commission. And then you are asking that charity as an intermediary to then grant those funds on to the organization, whether it's in the United States or somewhere else in the world, following the overseas donations guidance that HMRC prescribed quite neatly and concisely for us. In the States, they have a very similar process, actually. There's expenditure responsibility, and there's another one called equivalency determination. I'll come on to that last one in a second, but effectively, a very similar principle applies. If you're a US taxpayer and you want to make a tax-effective gift to an overseas organization, then you must do it through a US 501c3 who will then follow those steps and grant the money onto the charity. Equivalency determination is the principle that you can recognize a charitable entity in a different jurisdiction as being equivalent and, measured and regulated to the same standard as your own. We would love to see that in the UK. There has been some lobbying around that. I don't think it's the number one priority for the government, but
I'm afraid not.
It would be a very helpful tool to deploy. But as it stands, that's not available to us. And the only difference between legacy gifts is that, as you quite rightly say, in the UK, it doesn't matter where you're giving, you must give it through a UK charity to have the IHT relief. In the US, there is a probably not as well known, but still commonly used mechanism whereby within your will, within your estate, if you want to give to an overseas charity and still qualify for an exemption, then you can, providing that your executors can evidence suitably that the charity that ends up with the money is an equivalent charitable entity to an extent. So there is charitable purpose, the money is being used for a non-profit cause, and in that country it is registered with whatever charitable regulator exists. So that's something that does apply in the US through estate planning gifts to charities, which we actually find often the clients aren't aware of, and then we will point them in a direction of a good advisor like yourself to then take that work forwards.
We will certainly point someone back towards you, most commonly, let's say, during someone's lifetime. I always like to sort of try and point out if someone listening to this is an American living in the UK and they are thinking of making a charitable gift during their lifetime, if you take nothing else away from these two episodes, it's please proceed with caution if you're making a donation in the US or the UK during your lifetime. If you're, precisely as you already pointed out, Joe, if your alma mater is asking for donations in the US, if you want to make a donation to your local village charity, or you want to make a donation to any charity of your choice in the UK, you need to think very, very carefully about what the tax consequences in both jurisdictions are going to be. And I imagine that's particularly the case if you're not just giving cash. If you're actually trying to give something, a more sophisticated gift, if, I don't know, you're trying to give some shares or some other assets in specie, you then need to think even more carefully about what those tax consequences are going to be, because you're at a greater risk of the two tax jurisdictions diverging. And thus why speaking to not just a philanthropy advisor like Joe, but speaking to a US-UK philanthropy advisor like Joe, I think is so important. It's also not just about the actual tax relief itself, but the differing attitudes towards tax relief in the US and the UK, Joe. So how each jurisdiction allows relief, what they allow relief for, what the sort of, even what the general premise of charitable giving in each country relates to, how do you talk clients through that minefield of tax relief, of tax giving, how to make their gift so they're tax efficient? Or do you prefer to say to clients, give us the ball, we'll run it to the end zone and don't worry about it? How does that conversation happen?
Fortunately for us, the two jurisdictions align enough to make our lives relatively easy. So in terms of making for example, a cash gift to a charity or a gift of publicly listed stocks to a charity like us, the income tax relief and the capital gains exemption are really the same in many ways. Now, when it comes to giving slightly more complicated things like privately held stock or artwork or things, then we don't have so much overlap there, and that becomes trickier. And we could still do that, but it may not be tax effective in both jurisdictions simultaneously. Sure. For most gifts, of whether it's publicly held securities or cash, the way the tax treatment works is fairly straightforward. I mentioned earlier, there are some nuances and differences between the two. So in the States, what we would just think as a sort of charitable trust, a grant-making trust, is a separate type of entity, which is known as a private foundation. And I give an example. So in the UK, you can deduct 100% of your income in theory when it comes to your self-assessment and the tax relief available to you. Whereas in the US, if you give to a public charity, there's a 60% AGI limit on the relief that you can obtain. And if you're giving to a private foundation, that's a 30% cap. So there are reasons beyond just the control element we talked about earlier on with the private foundation why you might think twice.
AGI being adjusted gross income, I presume.
Yes, another acronym. Congratulations for pulling me up on that one. Yes, yeah, that's right. It's something to think about. I think more broadly, obviously, in the States, the idea of philanthropy is more relied on in the United States. Federal taxes are lower. In lots of cases, state taxes are lower than what you would be paying here in the UK. The welfare system in the States is not exhaustive. And so philanthropy, there are lots of debates about philanthropy versus taxation, but ultimately we are where we are, and philanthropy is hugely relied upon, and hundreds of billions of dollars are donated to charities every year in America, and particularly hospitals, schools, religious organizations, and that the ecosystem relies on that philanthropy. Whereas in the UK, I think there is less tax incentive to give, because unless you're a high rate taxpayer, you don't have the same relief available to you. Whereas in the States, really everyone's itemizing. And so there's an element of relief being available much more broadly in the States.
I didn't want to let Joe go before sort of taking a step back. We started on general themes, and I also want to end on general themes. In the time we have remaining, Joe, what are you seeing as sort of some of the key trends in philanthropy at the moment? What are the biggest changes or the biggest momentum shifts of when clients come to you and are thinking about their charitable giving? I had posed to you, well, you already mentioned one, I should say, which is ESG, sort of ethically sustainable investing. But presumably, post-pandemic, we are now back to an increasingly mobile world. You've mentioned the younger generation and their thoughts. What are sort of some of these key trends?
We're certainly seeing some of the things that you'd probably expect. We're seeing more interest in climate-related causes. We are seeing more interest in more innovative types of grants to charities. So something that we offer at CAF through our Impact Accelerator is the opportunity to offer sort of blended finance options for charities. So a grant and a loan for social enterprises particularly. That kind of mechanism seems to be more interesting to clients now. I think there's a slightly more, venture capital type approach to giving, and people like to, they like to support charities, but they also want to try and help charities become sustainable. And so those sorts of models are quite interesting. I think generally there are more conversations with higher level donors around the different types of structures available. And something that I would pose as a potential question or something to watch in the future is actually people who are looking to use non-tax effective structures for giving because of the flexibility that it offers. And so you look at someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who channels lots of his giving through an LLC without any interest really in the tax relief, but in the ability to be more prescriptive and controlling about where that money goes. And I think that's something that has actually become a conversation piece with some clients, particularly new clients who are looking to understand where does tax effective giving hold you back if you're looking to be more creative about the solutions to the problems of the world?
Sort of like the difference between not-for-profit and charitable. Just because you're doing something with a charitable aim doesn't actually ultimately mean you necessarily have to be charitable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also impact investing, we offer invested DAF, so clients who really want their DAF to be a long-term solution, we can invest the funds and help them to grow for the future. And not only have we been doing a lot of rebalancing, and we actually created some ESG funds ourselves, we have really interesting conversations with clients about impact investing, because anecdotally, and actually there was a study about 7 years ago in the States that suggested that some clients may decide that if they can suitably reallocate their personal investment portfolio to be more impact investment focused, that may actually replace their philanthropy. It would almost satisfy their need to create good in the world. And that is quite alarming, actually, for the non-profit sector, because we would not want to advocate for a loss of grants or donations to charities. And so I've had those conversations with clients, and it's certainly something to keep in mind.
I'll give you sort of one other trend that some colleagues and I have been discussing recently, and I can't take credit for this as a trend, but we were discussing charitable-focused innovation or innovation-focused philanthropy. I don't know which way around to put it. People using, or entrepreneurs using charitable vehicles and charitable funds to try slightly bolder and slightly more adventurous innovations and enterprises, knowing that if a charity fails, putting the charitable funds towards that purpose. Let's say you're doing something in cancer research, or you're doing something in, I don't know, trying to attempt to relieve poverty. You can take things on a slightly grander scale. You can take sort of slightly more risks with charitable funds in a way that, because you're not required to turn a profit, you can still apply the funds charitably for charitable aims and charitable ends. The thing might still crash and burn, but you've taken that risk. And if it's successful, fantastic, and you can then go on and do stuff with it. But this use of the charity sector almost as a safe haven and fertile ground for actually quite cutting edge innovation, is that something you see in the sector?
I would argue that that's one of the greatest things about philanthropy and charitable giving, is that, there are often debates around, why is giving needed at all? Shouldn't our taxes cover all needs in society? And I think some of the best examples of philanthropy are when a charity or a social cause has taken a chance and piloted a new concept or innovated and created a new type of solution to whether it's poverty or another social issue. And that has to be one of the really redeeming features of philanthropy, in that it can complement the role of government or states or councils or whatever it is, but it can also try new things and be much more agile than a large government funding stream or the UN. It takes years of procurement and planning to pull something off, but philanthropy can be very nimble and startup focused. And I think that has to be one of the great persuasive arguments for charitable giving, is that that's within our gift. And so yes is my answer, and I think that's a good thing.
What a positive, uplifting sort of note to finish on. That brings an end to today's podcast. Thank you, Joe, so much for coming on today. If anyone wants to learn more about Joe, about CAF as an organization, or about CAF US, I have no doubt if they do a bit of Googling, they will find you quite quickly. And I'm sure they'd be delighted to answer any questions that they may have. Otherwise, all it leaves me to do is to say thank you to you, the listener, for listening. And again, if you do like what you hear, please do leave us a review and join us next time.